Good evening and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on tonight's live stream. My name is Dawn Dale and I will be your host this evening. As you can see, we have a BSL interpreter, which is Sarah, who has joined us this evening. And welcome, Sarah. Tonight's event considers one of the most pressing issues of the pandemic. How do we protect the most vulnerable people in our society from the worst effects of the pandemic? This week, we reach what has become known as the cliff edge of some government support. As some schemes end and others are launched to take their place, we have to question and consider the role and ambition of the safety net in our society. This one-off Festival of Debate live stream features speakers from Citizens Advice Sheffield and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. We'll be inviting comments and questions from everyone watching the live stream tonight. We'll try and bring in a few comments throughout, but there will be also a 15-minute Q&A at the end of tonight's event to ask questions from tonight's guests. It's at this point that I'd first like to introduce one of our guests, Clare Lodder, who is the Chief Executive of Citizens Advice Sheffield. Clare, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Now, Clare, your organisation is a trusted organisation where people come often when they've exhausted all other options available to them. And many of the people will be experiencing hardship and are in need of advice and guidance or signposting to other services. I've got a couple of questions, if that's all right to ask. What is the current level of need in Sheffield? And is there an adequate safety net, in your view, for those who need it? Sorry, Clare, you're on mute. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think, Dawn, we don't actually know what the true need is in Sheffield, and we certainly don't know what it's going to be. I was just reading before we came on air that the ONS has said that 2 million people in the country are still on furlough, and there's only 2 days to go before the furlough scheme ends. That suggests that a big proportion of those people are not going to go back into their workplace. And what percentage of those people might live in Sheffield? Maybe 1% or something. So we're talking about large numbers of people that are yet to be made redundant. What I think we do know is that we are every day seeing the impact of COVID on people who don't have financial resilience. We know that this is not treating people equally, and those in the community that have the least resources, either they had the least resources before COVID, or they have been they found themselves losing their financial security at very short notice, and those are the people that we're seeing. And you asked me, is there a safety net? Is there an adequate safety net? I'm afraid that day in, day out, our advisors talk to people who are finding that the safety net that they thought was there isn't there, or certainly isn't sufficient.
Thank you, Clare. You touched on the millions of people who have been affected specifically by the coronavirus, and some have been hit harder than others. Have you got a picture of who you would be most worried about? You mentioned those that have not got financial stability.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think we're all worried about the people that we know haven't got enough money or won't have enough money to cover their essential living expenses, their food for themselves and their family, their fuel for heat and light, their housing costs. It's those people that we are the most worried about. Is it going to hit people differently? I think it is. And there's been further research this week from the Resolution Foundation that suggests that of the people that are going to be or have been made redundant, there's going to be a higher proportion of people that were on minimum wage. There's going to be a higher proportion of women, disabled people, and people from certain parts of the black and minority ethnic communities. So those are the people that we're most worried about. There's countless examples of where the system has treated people unfairly. But overall, we're really worried about the people that just won't be able to cover their everyday expenses.
Oh, thank you, Claire. So we all know across Sheffield that citizens' advice is really valuable and normally busy anyway. But have you seen an increase in demand for services since the pandemic started?
Yes, I mean, I think it's right that citizens' advice is a place that people turn to when things are really tough. And I'm very grateful to our staff and our volunteers that they have managed to deliver the service without interruption to the people of Sheffield, and that's a fantastic achievement. Every day, our phone lines are busy, up to 200 people a day calling us, and that's before some of the biggest impacts that have come. People are using our online resources. So yes, very busy, but I think even more than that, what we're seeing is that the issues that people are facing and that they're bringing to us for help are more complex, and their position is more difficult, and there are more times when we are really worried about people, because not only are they facing perhaps poverty, but we're actually seriously worried that they're destitute without any money at all, and the only thing that they've got is us being able to refer them to food banks. So I think yes, it's the volume, but it's also the complexity.
Thank you. I understand now, Claire, that we've got a video showing some of the staff from Citizens Advice talking about their regular calls for advice and assistance that they receive. Claire, would you just like to say something and introduce the video?
Yes, well, thanks, Dawn. So, we started off talking to our staff and volunteers about this was really just to get support between ourselves about what's it been like. And then we realised that the stories that our staff were talking about, of course, it's about people's lives, and that's the stories, really said something important about the safety net or the lack of it. And so this video is just a snapshot really of what we've been seeing over the last 6 months.
Thank you. Okay, everyone, sorry about that. It would appear that we are having some technical difficulties with the sound, but what I would like to let everyone know is that video is available on YouTube. So if you want to go and see that after this, then you're very welcome to do so. I would suggest it is worthwhile watching to get the information straight from the people who are on the front line, working and volunteering at the Citizen Advice Bureau. It's at this point now that I'd like to introduce our next guest, who is Iain Porter, who is from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and leads on social security policy. Thanks for joining us, Iain.
Hi there, Dawn.
Hi. So I suppose I'd like to ask you some questions as well, if that's okay. So we've just heard from Clare that Citizen Advice Bureau and from their staff, although we didn't hear it, we could read it, and I'm sure people will go back later and have a look at that because it is very interesting. We've heard about some of the current levels of need in society. How does this tally with the information that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have access to about the effects of the pandemic on our local communities, Iain?
Yeah, I mean, I know there was some problem with the sound on the video, but even seeing the words up on there and seeing people's faces explaining clearly what was going on, it really tallies with kind of the anxiety and the stress that we see day to day as well with the people who we work with. So I just want to pay tribute first to Clare and to Citizens Advice and all those staff, because it's a fantastic job they do. And a really tough job, and they're out there every day helping people, particularly those of us at most sort of risk in the pandemic, and out there challenging social injustice every day, which surely is what poverty is. Really, it's sheer social injustice. I want to pick up maybe on a couple of things that Dawn and her staff said there. Firstly, something that's really tallied with what we've seen at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation is how families with children in particular have seen real pressure on them at the moment. For example, someone there talked about the extra costs of children being at home from school, for example. Particularly salient at the moment with Marcus Rashford's campaign, which I think has been brilliant, as it's shown the kind of compassion that's out there in the public and everyone getting behind him, and really putting the spotlight on child poverty. Our own extensive polling of families with children on means tested benefits has found that 70% of those families had to cut back on essentials like food, like electricity, as a result of the pandemic. We found that 60% of families had to borrow money to get through it, and half of families have got into arrears on their rent or on other crucial bills. So families are really kind of struggling with that additional pressure at the moment. The second thing I think I want to pick up on is that point around kind of the most vulnerable in society and those most at risk. And what we found is that the waves of the coronavirus storm have really hit hardest some of the people who are most at risk of poverty going into the pandemic in the first place, which just, it just cannot be right. Particularly felt difficult, to be honest, talking to disabled people during the pandemic. And our most recent annual poverty report showed that of people in poverty, half of those people are living with a disability themselves or in a household with someone who's disabled. Yet, if you speak to people about their experiences in the pandemic, just imagine you need help with your personal care, washing, cooking, but those arrangements may have fallen away due to kind of pressure on services in the pandemic, maybe family carers unable to visit. So, you need to pay maybe for alternative help instead. So you need to cut back on essentials. You might skip lunch each day or decide to go the evening without the lights on to save electricity so that you can afford those extra costs. That's kind of some of the most difficult stuff that we see. And that's all borne out by official statistics from the ONS, for example, which has shown that disabled people are more likely than non-disabled people to be struggling with bills at the moment, and they're more than twice as likely to have lost their job as a result of the pandemic as well.
Wow, Iain, thank you for that. So we're coming up to winter now, Iain. You know, the weather's just turned and we've just put the clocks back, and we are looking at a second wave of coronavirus. What levels of need and hardship are you expecting in the UK, do you think?
I think, unfortunately, as was pointed out earlier, we come into the end of the job retention scheme. I think the recession's only going to deepen, only going to get worse. We're going to expect unemployment to rise. And there's kind of been a build-up, really, of pressure on family finances. So that stuff I mentioned earlier about families only getting by, sometimes by borrowing and getting into debt, that's all being stored up. And more waves of unemployment are coming down the road. So I think the need is only going to rise. And I'd like to particularly draw attention to something that's going to really add to that. When this storm hit us 6 months ago, the government did take some really bold, compassionate action quickly. And one thing it did was to uplift universal credit by £20 per week. And that really did help prevent a surge in poverty, we see. And was also a kind of really significant step forward in strengthening the social security system that we all now see and realise is so crucial for us in stormy times. Unfortunately, though, that is due to be cut in April. It was only a temporary measure. And so our modelling has shown that ripping away this £20 lifeline will mean that 16 million people are in families who will see that cut in April. That's over £1,000 a year being taken overnight from people. And our research shows that that has the potential to pull 700,000 more people into poverty, 500,000 more people into deep poverty, which is 50% below the poverty line. And we can expect it to make child poverty go up by around 300,000. So this is a really crucial thing that's going to make things even worse, I'm afraid, and will again disproportionately hit some of those most at-risk groups. I should point out that an equivalent lifeline at the time for people on legacy benefits that come before universal credit but are still around for a large group of people, they're mainly people who are disabled or sick or carers, actually. That equivalent £20 uplift wasn't extended, wasn't thrown to people at the same time. And that means around another couple of million people missing out and have been left behind during the pandemic. So yeah, this is really crucial because in a few weeks' time, the government is making a decision. It will announce what the support levels will be for universal credit from next April. And, you know, it can decide, I think, to keep doing the right thing, to keep the lifeline and keep families afloat, or it can decide to cut the lifeline, cut people's incomes and cut people adrift. And that is a crucial decision that's coming up in the next few weeks. And so I'd urge the government really to step up to the plate, keep doing the right thing, keep doing the compassionate thing, and keep that £20 lifeline and extend it to people on the legacy benefits.
Thank you, Iain. I couldn't agree more. I was going to ask you about the extension to legacy benefits, but you've talked to us about the impact about coronavirus, and we've touched on the impact of just basically not having any money. But how would you characterise or frame what the wider and long-term costs of poverty are? Because, you know, we talk about poverty a lot, and for people that don't understand poverty, it's not simply just not about just not having enough money, is it?
Well, no. I mean, what is poverty? Poverty fundamentally is when your financial resources are well below what's required to cover those minimum needs. And really we're talking about the minimum needs required to participate in society to an acceptable degree, to avoid shame as well as destitution. Clearly, the immediate impact of poverty is devastating on people, and we've heard a lot about that now already. Money running out, using up every bit of food in the cupboard to feed your children, probably going without yourself. Running out of money for the electricity, going without the lights on until you can borrow money from a neighbour. Maybe that's devastating for people right now. But yeah, the effects of poverty can be much more than that for people. It means kind of waking up every day, maybe feeling insecure, uncertain, restricted options, and it can have a really damaging effect as well on people's mental health. The stress and anxiety of living day to day like that can be overwhelming. It's not just mental health either. The physical health impacts of experiencing poverty are well documented. The Marmot review, for example, really robustly shows the wide disparity in healthy life expectancy for those on higher incomes versus those on lower incomes. So I think on average there's a 12 years difference in the healthy life expectancy between the lowest income people and people on the highest incomes. I think at the worst, in some of the worst areas, there's about an 18-year difference. So those kind of mental and physical health impacts are devastating too. If you think about the longer term, and again, this is kind of pertinent to what I was saying about child poverty. If a child experiences poverty right now, that actually has a massive long-term effect. A child who's experiences poverty is less likely to do well at school, more likely to be out of work when they grow older, more likely to grow up with health conditions. And really, I think, we've got to ask yourself, we should be really, shouldn't we, taking action now, particularly on that front. Otherwise, we're just going to cut a generation adrift in the future and be left with loads of children unable to fill their potential. It has huge, broad, long-lasting effects. But I'd say overall, as I said before, it really is a failure of social justice. And it's, as a compassionate and just society, it just cannot be right that millions of people can be pulled into poverty and left unable to fulfill their potential in the future.
Thank you, Iain. It's at this point now then that I'd like to bring Clare back in, so we can start to have a discussion about child poverty, and just touching on the Marcus Rashford campaign for free school meals, and the news that we did get last week that the government wasn't going to be supporting free school meals during the school holidays any longer. I know that a lot of local authorities have actually stepped in. Sheffield has, and Sheffield have also made a commitment that if the government don't do a turnaround and do it at Christmas, then I know that Sheffield City Council will be providing the vouchers for Sheffield children at the Christmas holidays as well, because it is an absolutely, it's a desperate situation that families find themselves in. So Clare, if I could ask you a question, given the Chancellor's latest announcements of support, do you think that the term cliff edge is still apt? Because we say cliff edge and some people might think we're kind of overreacting a little bit. Do you think it's still apt for the end of October and beginning of the November period?
Well, yeah, I do, Dawn. The furlough scheme ends in a couple of days. And I think we've got quite a lot of evidence now that the follow-on scheme that the Chancellor announced isn't really going to cut the mustard. It is going to end up with people who are maybe on the minimum wage only getting 70% of that, and I don't think it will be sufficient, particularly in Sheffield now that we've gone into tier 3. I don't think it'll be sufficient to protect those jobs. But there are other reasons why people have hit a cliff edge. We've seen across the debt and financial industries, we've seen a lot of the temporary holidays around mortgage payments and loan payments coming to an end. And so suddenly next month, people are going to have to find all those payments again. We've seen quite a lot of the protection on debt recovery action come to an end. And really importantly, we've seen, in essential terms, the protection from eviction coming to an end. Landlords can proceed with possession action against tenants now. The government has said that because we're in tier 3, they don't expect there to be bailiff action to actually evict. But that doesn't change the pressure on families, and that doesn't change the fact that families are really scared about losing their homes. So yes, I think we have come to another cliff edge.
Thanks, Claire. I'll come to you in a second, Iain, but if I can just ask a question on that, Claire, about the evictions. And you said that the government has said because we're in tier 3 that they don't expect action to be taken. But have they made that clear enough? Have they made it clear enough for tenants to know that they're not going to be evicted, or is there a bit of a loophole there, do you think?
I think that the actual act of eviction won't happen right now. But I don't think that really is the biggest issue, because I think the biggest issue is people knowing that they're not managing to pay the rent arrears are going up, and they know it's only a matter of time before that tenancy comes to an end. So yes, a little bit of a temporary reprieve from actually having your possessions put on the street, but I don't think that is the real pressure for people. And we know that that action is starting to happen, and we also know that a lot of the rules around universal credit are quite inadequate when it comes to covering housing costs. So those people that back in February, perhaps took on a tenancy believing they'd got a secure job, now find themselves without a job on universal credit, and universal credit may be saying, we're not going to cover all your rent for these reasons because you're a younger person. We don't think you should be living in a 1-bedroom flat. You should be in a shared house, and so on. The rules are complex, but the basic issue is that for many people, those essential payments just aren't covered.
Thanks, Claire. Iain, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I want to pick up on Claire's points on the job support scheme, really, and we've already seen it change now hastily, I think, at the last minute from the Chancellor, and made a bit better, particularly for the part-time version for employers will now have a much lower contribution they need to make, and hopefully that will mean, hopefully that can hold back a bit of the unemployment tide. But I think one thing to point out with it is, yes, 70% of a minimum wage is not going to be, it's still going to store up problems for lots of people who are already in poverty, in working poverty going into the pandemic. But one thing not to lose sight of is actually probably the biggest issues with it are people that won't be able to use that scheme. We've got lots of people, lots of employers that will still find it too expensive to use the part-time scheme, and so will lay people off. Millions of self-employed people who are actually having a really tough time, and that scheme is not going to help them. And the self-employed scheme is much less generous, and lots of self-employed people will have to fall back on universal credit, as will many people who are unfortunately going to lose their jobs, or also those people on 0 hours contracts, flexible contracts, where their employers can just, and we've seen already have cut their hours through those contracts and having to rely on universal credit. And so with that really is about making sure that the universal credit system is an adequate lifeline at this time.
Thanks. Yeah, that would lead me on to my next question then, for Claire. Do you think that the universal credit system needs to change to respond to the challenges presented by the pandemic? You know, we've got the 5-week wait, we have to take loans and get into debt. What is your view on the current system, Claire? Do you think it needs to change?
Yeah, I do, and I think it needs to change urgently. Even before the pandemic, we were calling for a root and branch review of universal credit. Universal credit, Sheffield was the last area to go into universal credit, and it was designed really, universal credit, to be rolled out gradually so that learning could be done from what worked and what didn't. And from my perspective, sadly, that learning doesn't seem to have been acted on. And yes, you've mentioned the 5-week wait. How can that be justified? How can a 5-week wait be justified when people are claiming universal credit because they have very little? And we see so many examples of people that take out a loan to cover them for the 5-week, and then of course that is taken from the universal credit. So yes, there are so many aspects of universal credit that need improving. The other one I would mention, and I'd be interested to know what Iain thinks of this, but it feels to me one of the most unjust things that right now people can end up claiming universal credit without having had advice and really understanding the complexities of the system. They might have previously been on tax credit or some other benefit. They find that universal credit hasn't made them better off. In fact, they don't want to be on universal credit, and they are not allowed to go back to the previous benefit that they were on. And the government has reasserted this. There is no way back onto a benefit, despite the fact that they may be significantly worse off on universal credit. How can that be right?
Thanks, Claire. Iain, would you like to come in on this and put your view across?
That's definitely an invitation from Clare as well to come back on that point, at which, yeah, absolutely agree, is a really important point to raise. Coming back to something I mentioned earlier about the fact that this £20 uplift was welcomed and given to people on universal credit, but that same lifeline wasn't extended to people on those legacy benefits, most of whom are on employment and support allowance, which people have to claim when they are sick or disabled, and that, you know, it's really, it's just not right that same support has not been extended to them. So this is where the point about them moving to universal credit is so important, and the government has said in some instances, well, they should just move to universal credit if they want to get the £20 uplift. But that's the point, that a lot of people don't have that choice to move anyway. They will lose out by substantial amounts if they move. That's something we've been trying to raise as an issue well before the pandemic. The vast numbers of losers, as well as people that win and that gain as well, but the vast number of losers who move from legacy to universal credit, but particularly amongst disabled people, and so that's just not an option. And we've definitely seen instances, I'm sure Clare's advisors have as well, of people who have maybe been told to move or suggested they move from their legacy benefit to universal credit in the pandemic, and they do that, but then they realise that actually they have lost a lot of support by doing that. They're on a lot less on universal credit, and there is no way back. That's it. So it's a huge risk from that happening. So it's a really good point. On kind of just the broader point about, you know, is universal credit, I suppose, fit to respond to the challenges that we see ahead of us? I think it'd be fair to point out that, you know, universal credit has, on the whole, coped in terms of this unprecedented, you know, massive increase in volume of claims, and so probably we should give some credit to the system for holding up. I mean, probably lots of people thought it would just collapse completely, but it's held up. So that's something for it. Something to point out, though, alongside that, is that that's probably happened in a large part because of some changes that were made on an emergency basis. For example, conditionality was suspended, so sanctions were suspended. People did not have to sign up to a claimant commitment when they came onto it during the pandemic, which are kind of these contracts that people have to sign saying what they're going to do to kind of be entitled to their benefit. That was all suspended, and I think a lot of leeway as well, a lot more leeway than normal was given to people in terms of verifying documentation, identities, and people of course didn't have to come into a job centre to complete that process. So quite a lot of the reason the system has stood up well has been from some of those changes, which actually we should think about, are they good things to be doing actually in the longer term, to soften, to use less sanctions, to soften the conditionality in it. I think just a final point on this, yes, we've done so much research on with claimants and others on the issues coming up in universal credit. The 5-week wait comes up in every single piece of research we do on universal credit. It's absolutely one of the top issues that needs to be just sorted out, because it's not right to ask people without savings usually in really turbulent time of their lives when they're claiming universal credit to be made more turbulent by having to wait a minimum of 5 weeks. None of us could really survive that long without money for that long, and for many people it just pulls them into destitution. But I think a lot of the issues actually apply to both universal credit and what came before it, and I would say that just the general adequacy of payments in the system, the adequacy of support, the strength of that lifeline that you need to rely on, which does affect UC and legacy alike. That's really been affected by a series of cuts and freezes over the years leading into the pandemic that left the system weakened, really. And I think lots more people are seeing that now and seeing a kind of a fraying lifeline. And that's a serious thing that needs to be addressed. Again, I come back to keep that £20 uplift. That's the minimum that we need to be doing right now to keep moving forward in strengthening that lifeline.
Thank you, Iain. Touching on that, what we need to be doing then, that would lead us quite nicely into my next question. So into the context of entering a deep recession, probably one of the worst recessions that will ever be in our lifetime, how should we prevent people from falling through the cracks of government provision? So you mentioned the £20 uplift, but do you have a view, Clare and Iain? Clare, do you want to come in first around what you think we could do?
Yes, well, there's an awful lot to be done, isn't there? And I think my overwhelming feeling is that we have to build economic recovery in an inclusive way, and the people that have particularly suffered from the impact of COVID financially, they mustn't be left behind. And we have to find a way of involving those people and giving people opportunities in the recovery. And I think that one of the ways of doing it is to ensure that, because a very good way out of poverty for those people that can do it is work, and a proper national strategy on skills development, training and work opportunities must be right, and must be right for people that are ultimately going to need to change what they do, because the jobs that they did before aren't going to be there anymore, and they've got to be supported whilst they equip themselves for new jobs. So I think that's the overwhelming thing. And then everything that Iain has said about the level of benefits, and also I would really like to feel that going forward we could get to the point where we could be as proud of our benefit system as we are of the NHS, and that people accessing the benefit system could do it in just like we access the NHS, and that we finally challenge the stigma and the stigmatizing language of people who claim benefits, because that doesn't help anybody.
Thank you, Claire. Iain, do you have anything to add to that?
Here, Claire. Yeah, totally agree with that. I think we should, hopefully, if something comes out of it, it's making us all, reminding us all really of the value of great public services. And I think how social security in that system is a public service that we all may need to rely on throughout our lives, and a well-designed and a well-funded public service of social security can really prevent people being dragged under when those currents of low pay, insecure work, a global health pandemic, and high costs like rising housing costs, which is actually another strong driver of poverty at the moment. When all those forces really whip around us, having that strong public service of a social security system that acts as an anchor is really, really important. And sort of tied to that, I'd say longer term, if we're focusing on that, getting that system right, we do need to be making changes to that system and designing that system in a way that puts people who have experience directly of using that system, of being in poverty, they need to be at the heart of designing that system. And I think if we had that going forward, then we would be able to achieve that strong public service that treats people with dignity and respect, and that is there for us all when we need it and when we fall into hard times like this storm that we're seeing now.
Thank you, Iain. I've got just another couple of questions, if that's all right. And we have got a question from someone who's watching, and I will bring that in. I just was wondering if you feel that over the last 6 months that the social contract between the relationship between citizen and state has changed over the last 6 months, and if so, in what way? Claire, do you have an answer to that, or Iain? Anyone?
Well, I'm not sure that it's changed, but I think one of the things that we're seeing is that there are people are coming to us with high hopes of what support and protection they're going to receive, and it is very difficult for our advisors when at times they have to say, no, actually, that's not gonna, you're not gonna get that. That is what you're meant to live on. What, you mean I'm meant to pay all my expenses out of that? Yes, that is. And I think that that may have a longer term influence, that people who've never used the benefit system have looked to it and have had a belief that the state would support them, and have found it lacking in some cases. And I think that may change the expectation. I hope it will anyway.
Can I just pick up on that actually? And there's a really good research study that's going on at the moment from some academics, I think led by the University of Salford, called Welfare at a Social Distance. And they've been running huge surveys of 7,000 new claimants through the pandemic. And they've kind of shown, that thousands of now kind of middle income professionals have lost their job during the pandemic and are turning to food banks themselves and are now experiencing the social security system themselves. And they found in a recent thing they put out that nearly 3/4 of those people who applied for universal credit but were turned away, nearly 3/4 of them said they were surprised, completely surprised, when they were refused benefits, and they thought that was unfair. So I think there is something potentially that could change because of the experience of many more people coming into contact with the system. Like Claire, though, probably I would say it's too early to tell right now. Joseph Rowntree Foundation actually is about to kick off a really big piece of work on this, to see, as I think one of the questions that came in referred to it as the Overton window, that window of possibility. What do people think on the social contract between state, individual, businesses and community, for example? I think we haven't kicked that off until now because I think, yeah, when you're in the heat of the moment, it's really hard to tell. You've got to let things settle a bit, but we'll see. What I'd say about the British Social Attitudes Survey, which was mentioned, I think, that kicked off the question, was actually, so this was, I think, in the headlines this morning, so it's showing that there's been a huge softening in public attitudes towards the benefit system, i.e. some of that scroungers versus strivers language may be a lot less pronounced now. That stuff was actually pre-pandemic, so that latest data is from 2019, and what you see is actually a longer term trend there. I think there was a kind of real what we would say as a low point really in the sort of 2010 2012 years, where most people or similar numbers of people thought that many people who get social security don't deserve any help. So back in 2010, more people agreed with that than disagreed, but already that was trending down, and by 2015 it had reduced substantially. So I think now only 15% agree. That's a record low, with that statement that that many people who get social security shouldn't deserve it. So it's actually a longer term trend, and we've been at places before, certainly in the sort of mid 1990s, of similar levels of softening to the social security. So yes, the pandemic's one thing, and I think we've got to wait and see what that means, but it is building on and coming after a longer term softening actually over the last decade.
Thanks, Iain. I think you've both covered a couple of the questions that our viewers really succinctly, actually, that our viewers have asked. I mean, coming on to that, someone has asked if we think that, does the cost of poverty outweigh the cost of resolving poverty? And another question in there is a universal basic income the only real safety net we can create? And I think, is it time to invest in something like universal basic income to resolve poverty? What are your, Claire, if you do have a view on that?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that sort of short term, medium term, I think there's lots of evidence to say that putting more money into social security, welfare benefits and support for poorer people actually has a positive impact on economic recovery, because obviously those people are going to spend that money because they don't have the options of saving or investing or anything else. And so I think there is quite a lot of evidence that says that is a good place to invest money. So before we look further ahead, I'd still be arguing more money in now to try and prevent some of the worst excesses of poverty, which have such a huge cost far beyond the individual. In terms of the universal basic income, I think the sort of concept has been around a long time, hasn't it? And I always think about it in terms of, what do I really like about something like child benefit or the state pension? And the real issue is that it's universal, and so there isn't the stigma and the underclaiming about it. It's straightforward. Everyone assumes they're going to get it. More recently, child benefit has in effect been taxed for higher tax earners. State pension has always been, and that sort of principle is where you pull together the benefit system and the tax system seems entirely sensible to me. The universal basic income, I think there are some issues around making sure that it can both be simple enough and universal, yet take into account where people have got significantly additional costs. I'm not sure what the answer is there. Iain may have more to say on that, but the principles of it, yes, I'm all for it.
Thank you, Iain.
Yeah, on this weighing up the costs, I think it's just not even something that they, they've had a weighing scale. The cost of poverty just, slam the scale down into the floor. It's you know, it's actually really hard to count up all of the things in a sort of accounting way. But even if you just try and pick out the really tangible costs of poverty, costs of dealing with poverty, JRF did some research on this a few years ago and found that just those very specific tangible costs of dealing with poverty costs us about at least £80 billion a year. To put that into context, the government spends around 50 billion a year on all the schools in England, and that's just a really, really kind of that's the bare minimum cost that you can really put a number on, and that's because of the costs associated with some of the things I mentioned earlier, like the increased health costs, dealing with additional health problems, extra school spending, extra spending on children's services, social care, etc. But I think, yeah, really, that's an accounting is one thing, but what really matters is that impact on people and the injustice of it, and just that loss of skill and talent, and how can we as a country be doing the best we can when we're missing out on the skills and talent from so many people whose options have been restricted and restrained because of poverty, and are unable to live those fulfilling lives and fulfill their potential, really. Turning to universal basic income, I think my priority right now, as I said before, is that our means tested safety net at the moment is really getting threadbare. The adequacy of that has been cut back over the years, and the priority needs to be to strengthen that in the ways that we've talked about. In the longer term, I think where UBI proponents come from is absolutely right. It's thinking about something else that is important to lots of the people who live in poverty, who we talk to, which is not just about the level of income, but it's about how secure is your income, and how much certainty is there in your life. And we do know that there are issues, for example, that we've highlighted a lot with universal credit and this monthly assessment period, which means that payments go up and down. It's very volatile, can be particularly difficult for people on contracts that are not permanent contracts, 0 hours contracts, and even for people who aren't paid monthly in line with that monthly universal credit cycle, people who are paid weekly. That causes these unnatural fluctuations in universal credit. And then of course there are all the difficulties of accessing it in the first place and the long minimum 5-week wait that there is. So I think it's absolutely right. We have to be thinking about what's the solution to that? What can we do with that? Now, I think there can be lots of things that can be done with the will and pretty quickly to improve and to fix universal credit, for example. It needs substantial fixing, it needs substantial investment, but it can be done as a priority. But in the long term, I mean, we should definitely be open to looking at the evidence for what other ways there are to tackle some of that insecurity, for example. What I would say is that you've got a lot of persuading for the public to do, to probably raise the amount of tax that you would need to do to put in an adequate level for a basic payment. That doesn't mean there might not be a way of doing it combined with the rest of the system, but fundamentally you can't go anywhere near that kind of thing unless you're sure it's not going to increase poverty in other ways by taking money out of the places where people who most need it most are.
Thank you. I've got some great questions that have come in, and you have touched on quite a few of them actually. And we are running out of time at the moment, but I would like to ask, housing is one of the biggest living costs for everyone, really. And so someone has asked, should there be things like rent caps? Should we consider rent caps Has anybody got a view on that? Do we think that would help people out of poverty if we had that system? Okay.
Well, what I'd say about this is that I mean, it's a much bigger issue, isn't it, than welfare benefits, social security. It's the provision of housing, and it's the provision of affordable housing, good quality affordable housing, and that's what people need. And the difficulties is that we don't generally have that in this country, and we also don't have a really good set of regulations and laws around the private rented sector and some security in there, and that skews lots of other issues, such as how much money should you get towards your rent, your housing costs, your mortgage, and it is something that the social security system has been sort of grappling with over the years, and there's been lots of iterations, and the one that we've got at the moment with universal credit means that certainly some groups of people are really disadvantaged because they're not considered that they should be living in the accommodation that they are living in, whether that's the size of the accommodation or that they are younger people and living and paying for rent on their own. Beyond that, I'm not sure. I think I'll let Iain comment on anything else to add to that, but I think it's really about affordable housing.
I'm afraid I'm just going to agree actually there with Claire that it's fundamentally we have a shortfall of social housing, affordable housing, particularly social housing, and we need massive investment in that right now. The rise of housing costs has been, as I say, one of the key drivers of poverty over the last decade, in particular because housing costs have risen much faster for people on lower incomes than people on higher incomes. And recently that's because of a great shifting of people into the private rented sector. So a lot of the increase in-work poverty that we were seeing going into the pandemic, 70%, more than 70% of children in poverty being in a working family, a lot of that in recent years came from a huge increase in working parents being pulled into poverty, and a lot of that driven by not just cuts to social security, which was important, but also a lot more families with children ending up in the private rental sector because of a lack of affordable housing and a lack of social housing. And that's where we need to see much greater ambition and investment from the government.
Thank you. We've got just another couple of questions, and then unfortunately we could actually carry on talking about this well into the evening, I'm sure. The one question I need to ask is, what external shocks ahead should civil society be giving a response to in the next 6 months? And how do we think that the response should be characterised? Iain, Claire?
Well, I'll go first if you like. Well, I think I've sort of already said this. Certainly in Sheffield, what I think we are facing is a very large number of redundancies, and I think that we need to be gearing up right across our communities as a city, seeking the support nationally to cope with this and the impact that it's going to have right the way through our communities. Yes, so that's what I think we'll be facing in the next 6 months.
Thanks, Claire. Iain?
I will refer back to my point about the universal credit £20 lifeline that's coming to an end in less than 6 months. In that window, I've spelt out the kind of effects that will have. It's a very clear thing that's coming up with a very clear effect that will happen, and a very clear answer that we can do, that government can take on it now, which is to, in a few weeks' time, when the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions and the Chancellor stand up and announce what the benefit rates are going to be for next year, that they keep that lifeline and they keep families afloat, and they make that £20 uplift permanent, and please extend it, throw that lifeline to people on the legacy benefits who have been left without so far in the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Iain. I completely agree. I think the final question, and then we'll come to just a few comments if you want to make some additional comments. Going back to the free school meals thing, because we are in there right now, and I know I've had a lot of questions from constituents regarding the universal free school meals and the means tested free school meals. So the voucher scheme doesn't cover children on universal free school meals under 7. It's only for children on means tested free school meals 7 and over. Do we think there's an argument for starting a universal free school meals offer for all children?
Well, I certainly do. Look, how much evidence is there that children perform, learn and thrive if they have the right sort of food and water actually at school. Certainly I know of so many people that say, if it wasn't for free school meals, I would not have managed to get through and do what I've done in my life. I think that it actually is a really good way of targeting support. But how fantastic would it be if it was universal? Remove any stigma that there is and make it a universal offer as part of the nation's support to children rather than around poverty.
Thank you, Claire. Iain?
I think that's certainly a good point about the stigma that lots of children can feel who are in poverty, and if free school meals are not done in the right way, that can really affect children in that way. I would say that there's something that could definitely be done if the government wanted to, which is actually has been raised by Marcus Rashford and the National Food Strategy, which is where those recommendations come from that Marcus Rashford refers to. And that's that even at the moment, free school meals is only goes to a subset of children who are in poverty. And they're actually a huge number of children who are living in families in poverty, particularly in working poverty, who already aren't entitled to the free school meals. And that's grown and grown because of this in-work poverty that grew. So you see more and more, we've seen over the last few years, more and more stories from teachers and from parents and children from themselves actually, of their parents struggling to get by on low paid work and not being entitled to free school meals because the threshold for claiming free school meals under universal credit was lowered to just £7,400, and that leaves a lot of children who are in poverty unable to rely on that support. So at a minimum, the government could be extending free school meal eligibility to all children on universal credit, and that would make a world of difference too.
Thank you, Iain. I think for me, the sooner we start to see spending money on our young people and families as an investment rather than a cost and a burden, I think the better off our society will be. We need to invest in people. We tend to invest a lot in buildings and roads and stuff, but that's just my view. We need to invest in people. I think, Claire, we are coming to a close now. We're literally at 8:05. Have you got any final comments that you'd like to make this evening?
I think I'd really like to take us back to where we began, which is really to say that Citizens Advice, our services are here for Sheffield communities, and I'm very grateful to our staff and volunteers that you know, overcoming the barriers and are managing to help a fantastic number of people. So thank you to all those people that contributed to this and that appeared in the video. Yes, we'll continue to do what we do and help support our communities.
Thank you, Claire. Iain, do you have anything you'd like to just say before we finish?
Just to say, you know, we've seen huge evidence that we are a society that does believe in compassion and justice. And so let's garner that compassion and justice, and let's make sure that none of us are pulled under by this storm. And let's very clearly say in this urgent decision on the £20 uplift to universal credit can make a huge difference. The government should give people certainty and stability now by announcing now that that's going to be made permanent and extended to those on legacy benefits.
Thank you, Iain. Well, that's it for tonight, everyone. I'd just like to thank our two guests, Clare Lodder from Citizens Advice Sheffield and Iain Porter from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. This has been the Festival of Debate live stream, and I've been Dawn Dale, and thank you very much.
Thank you.